Thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to present my research. And the question of my research is, do investors care about biodiversity? And I should mention, it is joint work with my co-authors, Garel, Petit, Romek, and Wagner. Now, you may have seen this phenomenon here, the so-called windshield phenomenon. When I was young, and I was riding on a motorway with my parents, I remember that after the ride, the windshield was full with dead animals, with dead flies, dead mosquitoes. Now, if you now drive on a motorway, this is entirely different. Usually you would not see any more dead bugs, mosquitoes, and alike on the windshield. This is a manifestation of biodiversity loss. The fact that the number of species in natural habitats, in my example, insects, has decreased significantly over time. With biodiversity, we mean the variety of living organisms in all habitats, and we have seen a massive loss of this biodiversity over the last years. For example, there are estimates from the WWF that since the 1970s to 2018, the world has seen a almost 70% loss of monitored wildlife. And you see this here also in the figure, a massive decrease with some confidence intervals around it in the so-called Living Planet Index, which reflects biodiversity. Now, the loss of biodiversity is not just a tragedy for the species that are lost, it's also a huge risk for humanity. Because according to some estimates, 50 and even more % of economic growth of GDP depend in one way or the other from biodiversity. So the fact that we are observing biodiversity loss has economic consequences, and that is exactly the focus of our research. We try to estimate whether investors, when pricing stocks, incorporate the damage that some companies generate on biodiversity and see when this pricing has started to emerge, how big it is, and also more fundamentally, how we can measure the biodiversity loss that is created by companies. Now, as an illustration of the significance of biodiversity loss for economic systems, I have a little illustration here. In this picture, you see a farmer in China that is pollinating by hand apple trees. And he has to do that because we've seen in China, but also elsewhere, a significant decline of bees. And that is a threat, as you can obviously see, for agriculture, in that case, farming apples. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is not just a massive decline in biodiversity, but also an increasing awareness, now coupled with looming regulatory intervention to combat that loss in biodiversity. Now, already in the 90s, we have seen all kinds of attempts, for example, through the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, to address biodiversity loss through regulation. But by and large, these efforts were not overly successful. This has changed entirely when in 2021 and 2022, we have had the COP15, and the first significant global agreement to combat climate change, as reflected in the Kunming Declaration 2021 and the Montreal Agreement in 2022. So think of these international agreements as the Paris Agreement equivalents for biodiversity. So they're very significant and will significantly change future regulation. Now, similar to the debate in the climate finance space and the climate-related regulation, we also see additional facts by NGOs beyond the governments that are regulating and investors, And I think a nice example for this is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is modeled after the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and was launched in June 2021 and is initially on a voluntary basis asking companies to disclose on nature-related risks and opportunities. The final framework was just released in September 2023, and there's a broad agreement that while this is initially voluntary, it is only a question of time until when nature-related, biodiversity-related disclosures will also become mandatory for companies. We also see movements on the side of central banks regulators with them paying additional attention now also to biodiversity risks. And we've seen some regulators actually making statements that are indicating that we are potentially facing also a systemic risk. So also from that side, it's very likely that we're going to see regulation moving forward. Now, despite these trends, the significant trend in biodiversity loss and the significant efforts trying to combat it, we basically don't have a lot of fundamental research that helps us understand the link between biodiversity and finance. We're in a situation that is a bit similar to the situation we had in the climate finance literature about 5 years ago, when essentially in the top journals, you didn't have a lot of papers, none actually, published on how climate risks are addressed by investors, whether they're priced and. So in this paper, we're the first that document that biodiversity risks are actually priced in financial markets, and I'll give you all the details as I go along my presentation. Now, in order to test whether biodiversity risks are priced, you need a measurement. You need to measure how companies affect biodiversity, how they negatively impact it. And so we're able to do this because we were able to get data from Iceberg Data Lab on the biodiversity footprint, the impacts that these firms have on biodiversity for a large sample of publicly listed firms. And we have this measure, this corporate biodiversity footprint measure available from 2018 to 2029 for more than 2,000 firms. From 2018 to 2021 for about 2,000 firms. Now, the data and the measures that I'll present to you, they're of relevance for investors. We know this because we know that several major institutional investors, including BNP Paribas Asset Management or AXA Investment Managers, have been using the measure that we're using. So let me give you some details of what this measure does. The measure is called, I mentioned this, the corporate biodiversity footprint, and it aggregates the biodiversity loss that is caused by firm activities resulting from environmental pressures. This could be land use, nitrogen depositions, or emissions, or the release of toxic compounds. Now, what you need to know in order to understand the corporate biodiversity footprint, or CBF, is the concept of mean species abundance. Because in a sense, what the CBF measures is the change in MSA, in mean species abundance, that is caused by a company's business activities and the resulting environmental pressures. Now, this MSA metric is actually quite important if you follow the biology literature and all kinds of international organizations, because it's a reference metrics, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity. Right, so in a nutshell, think of the measure we use as a measure that tells us how a company's activities change the mean species abundance, biodiversity, as a result of its activities. Now, we need to understand what MSA is. So here's an illustration. What you see here is a picture where in the top you see a situation where the mean species abundance is perfect, everything is pristine. We have 100% MSA, and at the bottom you see the opposite, with an MSA of 0. So what we're trying to quantify here, or what the data provider is trying to quantify here, is how in a certain spatial field in an area, MSA is changing because of a firm's business activities. And the metric that we're using is measured in kilometer squares MSA. And if, for example, a firm's CBF score is 100 kilometer square MSA, it tells us that the business activity of that company reduce mean species abundance by 10% over 1,000 kilometer square, or alternatively by 1% over 10,000 kilometers. So this is what the MSA metric, that's what the CBF is telling us. So think of it as a measure that tells us how mean species abundance is reduced as a result of a company's activities. Let me give you some facts about the measure. The mean CBF, the mean corporate biodiversity footprint of the firms in our sample, is 122 kilometers square. But importantly, there's huge variation in the sample. It's quite small for some companies, but very, very big for others. And an example that actually a newspaper was picking up from our study is the biodiversity footprint, the CBF of Danone, the French dairy company. And so as the newspaper wrote about the number from our papers, this company degrades biodiversity in an area that is greater than Lebanon from 100% to 0. Now you may wonder why Danone? Well, the main reason being, of course, because they're using milk products. And as an input for the milk products, there's milk that is produced from cows. And if you have lots of cows, of course, they need land. And this land, this farming land, is, of course, degrading biodiversity. Now, where is the largest CBF in terms of sectors? Well, it's largest, the negative impact on biodiversity, among retail and wholesale firms, followed by paper and forest firms, and eventually by firms in the food sector. There are different sources of a firm's environmental pressures, and the biggest source of negative impact on biodiversity is originating from land use, followed by greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, and air pollution. So these are the four sources of a firm's impact on biodiversity as measured by the data provider. Now, as you can see from my Danone example, scope 3, supply chain impacts for biodiversity are very important. In my example, it's the cows that are not owned by Danone, but some farmers that are producing the milk are the key driver of the company's overall footprint. And you see this also here, right? On the left, we show that about 50% of the overall corporate biodiversity footprint in our sample is coming from land use, followed by greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, and air pollution, as I indicated earlier. And on the right, you see that 80% of a firm's corporate biodiversity footprint originates from scope 3 impacts. So not direct ones from a firm's own production, but indirect ones through the supply chain. Now, interesting also for you is that many companies do not talk about their own impacts on biodiversity, on biodiversity risk in their 10Ks. They are not yet addressing these risks in their 10Ks. And you see this here. What we are showing you is for firms that do and do not talk about biodiversity risk in their 10Ks, the distribution of our measure, the corporate biodiversity footprint. And you see that these distributions are very similar, which means that that there are lots of firms that have a very big impact on biodiversity, but at the same time do not talk about that risk at all. Yes, you also have some firms that have a big CBF and do talk about it, but it's by far not so that all firms that negatively impact biodiversity talk about it. Now, I'm very convinced this will change a lot moving forward, with more investors and regulators putting attention to the topic. Now, the key question of our paper is whether investors care about the biodiversity impact of companies. And so what we're doing to analyze this is we're trying to see whether there is a risk premium that is associated with investing in companies with a big negative impact on biodiversity. In order to establish this, what we're doing is we're trying to explain stock returns as a function of the biodiversity footprint of the companies. And now, if we look at our full sample period, we don't find that there is a link between the CBF, the biodiversity footprint, and stock returns. However, what we discover is when we split the sample years into a period before and after Kunming, we do find that after the Kunming agreement, investors are starting to price biodiversity risk and are starting to demand a risk premium from those companies that very negatively affect biodiversity. In terms of numbers, a 1 standard deviation increase in the log of the CBF implies returns at about 2.4% large annually. So quite a significant risk premium. Now, you can imagine that the CBF correlates also with carbon emissions, because lots of the firms that negatively impact biodiversity also have large carbon emissions. It's, as a matter of fact, a source of the CBF. So in our research, we make sure that the results we're capturing here are not simply reflecting carbon risk premium. It's more than that. It's a specific biodiversity risk premium. And so what is the idea that is underlying this? Well, the idea that is underlying this is that there is looming regulation, and I indicated this earlier. And firms that are having a more negative impact on biodiversity are therefore more exposed to this looming regulation. And the uncertainty around this leads to investors demanding a higher return when investing in companies that have a very negative impact on biodiversity. So biodiversity risks have arrived in financial markets, and investors started to price them. That also means that not just investors have to start caring about biodiversity risks, but also the companies themselves, because they can reduce their own cost of capital, the flip side of the returns, when reducing the impact they have on biodiversity. Now, what we also show in the paper using an event study is that in the days around the Kunming declaration, right, now looking at daily return rather than before monthly returns to estimate the risk premium, we find that those firms that have a very large impact, negative impact on that biodiversity relative to those with a smaller impact, lost significantly in value. And you see this here in the figure, the 5 plus minus 5 day window around the Kunming declaration, which was at date 0, right? Before and after, no significant difference in returns between large and small CBF firms. But on the day of the announcement of the declaration, those firms that very negatively impact biodiversity saw a significant decrease in market valuation. Now, this is useful to show because, of course, the higher expected returns that I showed you earlier have to come into play as a result of lower valuations of these firms that negatively impact biodiversity. And that's exactly what we see here. In the paper, we look at other important events and show similar results also for other important events. For example, when the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures was launched, and have a similar picture to what you see here. So what are the key takeaways? Well, we introduce a new measure of the corporate biodiversity footprint to the literature, which captures how a firm's business activities negatively impact the variety of species on Earth. We then study the cross-section of returns and reactions to major events, establishing that those firms that are more negative on biodiversity have to deliver higher stock returns to compensate investors for the looming transition or regulatory risk that comes with this, and also lost value around major biodiversity-related events like the Kunming Declaration. So the takeaway is that investors start caring about biodiversity risks. Biodiversity risks have arrived in financial markets, and no investor and company can ignore those risks.